Hi folks, I'm Rob Poyton of the Innsmouth Book Club. Welcome to today's Innsmouth excursion. I'm back over the border in Bedfordshire. In fact, I'm just on the edge of Bedford town itself. Now, Bedford is a town with a long history. It was first mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles in about the 6th century, and for a couple of hundred years it was the front line between the invading Danes and the Anglo-Saxons. So there's a lot of history in the town, and naturally that brings with it a lot of stories of ghosts and hauntings. So I'm going to do a session on Bedford separately, but what I also thought is there's lots of little villages dotted around Bedford, each of which has many of their own unique tales of ghosts and paranormal events. You may remember the very first excursion we did was to Clophill, St Mary's Church, which is literally just down the road about a mile or so from here. So where I am today is on the south edge of Bedford in a place called Cardington, and this is home to one of Bedford's most well-known landmarks, Cardington Hangars, or as they're known locally, Cardington Sheds. Now you might be thinking, well, where are these so-called sheds? Well, take a look over there and I think you might just see them. So the sheds were built in 1915 by the Short brothers. They had been taken on by the Admiralty to construct airships. Now, airships were very much the in thing at the time. In the First World War, for example, there were frequent Zeppelin bombing raids over London. In fact, my grandmother once told me that as a child, or as a young sort of teenager, she remembers seeing a Zeppelin being shot down over London. That probably would have been around sort of 1915, 1916. So post First World War, airships became the way to travel. So there were a number of airships built in these hangars. Of course, the most famous being the ill-fated R101. That was built alongside the R100, which I think was constructed in Yorkshire, which was then brought down here and was actually launched from here, and then later on the R101 was also launched from here. Now we're going to talk about the R101 a little bit later, but just to fill in the history of the sheds here, post the R101 tragedy, they were pretty much closed down for airship production, and instead the RAF took them over, and they were used by the RAF till about 1967, mostly for building barrage balloons, particularly during the war. I think there were also troops stationed here during the war for training, and in the 1950s the hangars were used by the parachute regiment for jump training. In the 1990s the sheds were used to test buildings. So imagine the size of the sheds here. Multi-storey buildings would be built inside them out of wood, concrete, whatever, and they would then be tested to destruction. So basically to test the safety of various types of building and building materials. Following that, the hangars were left largely unoccupied and fell into disuse and disrepair until I think it was about 2010 a new owner bought them and started a major refurb project. Now you can imagine what a huge project that was. It cost millions of pounds. I think they had to replace something like 5 million rivets and used something like 10 million tons of steel. So a huge refurbishment project, and that brought the hangars back into use. Today the hangars are best known for their use in film and music. A lot of people come here to rehearse. I guess inside they're that big you can set up stadium lighting rigs and that kind of thing. So people like Paul McCartney, U2, AC/DC have all come here to use the hangars for rehearsal. And more famously than that probably, they've been used in numerous films. In fact, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, or part of it, was filmed on this site. But since then it's been used to film Star Wars, the Batman films. A whole range of Warner Brothers films in particular have been shot on sets inside the hangars here. But that main association, particularly from our paranormal aspect, has always been with the tragedy of the R101. So the R101 was built in 1929, and as we mentioned before, it was part of a pair of airships commissioned by the government, and these were going to be the new way to travel around the British Empire. The R100 actually flew to Canada, and the R101 on its maiden flight was heading for Karachi in India. Now, these were huge machines, the largest airborne vessels of the time, certainly. The R101 was about 220 metres in length, which is the equivalent of 3 jumbo jets. Absolutely huge, and the hangars had to be extended in order to get both of the airships in. Now, it was said that the testing for the R101 was somewhat rushed, perhaps due to political pressures at the time. As you can imagine, with the huge expense of this kind of project, there was a lot of pressure on the people involved to get results. And so it was that around 7 o'clock on the evening of the 4th of October 1930, the R101 set out for its maiden voyage. And as I said, the destination was Karachi in India. So that's a huge flight, even by modern standards. On board the R101 were the captain, Flight Lieutenant Irwin, and a number of top brass and dignitaries and politicians of the day. Over 50 people in all. At the time of takeoff, there was a light rain, and the R101 had to shed some ballast even to just get aloft and moving. By the time it got over the channel, the rain had become very heavy, and also strong winds had blown up as well. By the time it crossed the French coast, the R101 was already off course, owing to the strong winds. As well as that, the heavy rain has significantly increased the weight of the airship, so it was already beginning to descend. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, the airship went into a dive, which it recovered from, but then shortly after went into another dive and ended up going into the ground, into the edge of some woods close to the town of Beauvais. Although the landing was quite soft and relatively gentle, the airship immediately burst into flames. 46 of the crew and passengers were killed instantly, and 2 later died in hospital. There were only 6 survivors, and some say they only survived because the water tanks burst and kind of carried them out through the fire to safety. The bodies were brought back to the UK, and there was a remembrance service at St Paul's, and the bodies were laid in state at Westminster for a period of time, and then they were brought here to Cardington to St Mary's Church, where they were interred. And in fact, we can still see the monument today to those who lost their lives. As you can imagine, an event of this magnitude and so tied up with the pride and status of the nation was huge news and caused a great amount of shock throughout the country. As you might also imagine, a tragedy of this magnitude has resulted in a number of accounts of paranormal activity. The most common sightings are of crew members seen around the village to some extent, but most of the activity appears to be in the hangars or in the sheds themselves. So, for example, things are moved around, lights are switched on and off, and a number of security staff have reported their dogs acting very strangely in certain areas of the sheds. But the main paranormal event happened just a couple of days after the crash. Harry Price held a seance in London with the aim of actually getting in touch with Arthur Conan Doyle, but something else entirely happened. So I'm sure the name Harry Price will be familiar to many of you. He was the leading paranormal investigator of his day, and probably most well known for his work at Borley Rectory, which, as the raven flies, is not that far from this spot either. So he set up this seance, and he brought in a well-known medium called Eileen Garrett, and as I said, the aim was to contact Arthur Conan Doyle. But through her spirit guide, another voice came through, a masculine voice that identified itself as Irwin. This voice then proceeded to give a very detailed technical account of the last moments of the R101 and what actually happened on board before it went down. Now, obviously, this was before the days of Google and in the internet. You couldn't just look this information up. It was accessible only to very few people who were working on that particular project. So obviously the press went wild with this story, and skeptics came forward, and there are many accusations of fakery and so on. But the interesting thing was, all the details that Garrett spoke were written down. They were taken down in shorthand by a secretary who was present. These were later given to one of the team at Cardington, one of the engineers, to check over, and he verified their contents. He verified the accuracy of the information, certainly from a technical level. Even stranger, the Voice also spoke about future experiments that were being set up, which were to do with mixing different types of fuel in different proportions. And again, this would be even less widely known information, certainly known only to a few top people involved in that particular project. Furthermore, included in this account of how the airship crashed was the mention of a very small village. I think the saying was something like, "We skimmed the rooftops of this particular village." And no one knew about this. Some people checked on maps and they couldn't find it, so they said, well, that's obviously proof that it doesn't exist. But Price later looked into this, and he did find this village that would have been on the OS map of France, and it was very, very close on the path to the crash site. Now, Eileen Garrett passed away in 1970 at the age of 77. And in her memoirs, she spoke about this, of course, but also she spoke about several premonitions she'd had about airships crashing. And this was pre the two airships being launched. But as that event drew nearer, she was so alarmed by these premonitions that she got in touch with Sir Sefton Brenker. He was the director of civil aviation, to warn him about a possible impending catastrophe. He, of course, ignored it, and unfortunately he was on the R101 at the time, and he was one of those passengers who perished in the crash. Eileen Garrett said in her memoirs she always thought that her spirit guide was part of her own subconscious, and what she was doing was accessing parts of the brain or accessing certain senses that are present, if dormant, in all of us. So she never saw the work she did as supernatural as such, but perhaps as something beyond known science, something inherent in all human beings. And in fact, she seemed quite almost blasé about these things that happened to her and her experiences. And there's a quote from her. She said something like, maybe there's something in it, maybe there isn't. So it's an interesting perspective, probably almost Faultian perspective, on what is, certainly in my experience, one of the strongest indicators of communication after death. So that's today's Innsmouth excursion. I hope you like that look at a local landmark. If you have any comments or suggestions of places you'd like me to visit, or any new information you can shed on what we've spoken about today, then do pop a comment below, or of course you can post up on the Innsmouth Book Club Facebook page. If you're interested in weird fiction, ghost stories, horror movies, strange music, paranormal events, then do take a listen to our podcast at the Innsmouth Book Club. Every fortnight we visit Innsmouth and have a chat about some of our favourite things. I'll see you next time.